So I just read the greatest book ever written about Hawaii. And maybe that's hyperbole and depends on how one measures greatness, but I don't think there has been a book about Hawaii that has had as much of an impact on the state as this one. Say hello to James Michener's Hawaii. Now, it's a 1,000-page novel published in 1959, so it's a little dated, but still, as a local from Hawaii, I really enjoyed it. I didn't think I would, but I did. So in this video, I want to get a little literary. Dust off the college degrees. This is the BA. This is the other BA. Ah yes, here's the master's degree. And just talk about Hawaii and how some of the observations made in this book apply to Hawaii today. And let me know if you've read this book in the comments below. And if you haven't, that's okay. Summer is coming up and it would be a great summer read. Chapter 1, From the Boundless Deep. So this book opens with the formation of the Hawaiian Islands. It's purely fictional, of course, no one was there. From a reading standpoint, it's pretty boring. There's no characters, there's no dialogue, just a narrative of things coming to Hawaii and forming. And that could actually turn off a lot of readers. It did for me initially. Now I found it very interesting though, because I've never really put much thought into how most of the things got to Hawaii. Now, based on my Hawaiiana class back in elementary school, I remember a lot of things were brought here. I remember specifically the chicken, the pig, and the dog were all brought here initially. But I'm assuming that there was so much life already here before the first people arrived. So how did all of that get here? Because Hawaii is so isolated. And I'm talking about things like the trees, the birds, and even the fertile soil. Like, how did the soil get so fertile? It couldn't just be because of the volcano. And I'm assuming that by the time the first visitors to Hawaii arrived, there were already native plants here and fish and animals and all these wonderful things that we just take for granted. Now, a couple of quotes that really stood out to me. An authentic natural paradise where each growing thing had its opportunity to develop in its own unique way, according to the dictates and limitations of its own abilities. I love this description of Hawaii because I see how this statement, although intended for nature and the natural world, can apply to people today. I think people here develop in their respective and unique ways, and it's often according to their own abilities, whether it's their own resourcefulness or inherited resources from their family. And today we see this through many of the local small businesses. I know it's been a tough couple of years lately in Hawaii, and many businesses have closed or are really struggling, but there have also been some very resourceful and clever people who started businesses that thrived during this time. And the second passage from this chapter, for these islands were a crucible of exploration and development. Now, a crucible means severe trial leading to the creation of something new. And I think this plays out more than we think in Hawaii, particularly when it comes to locals and those who move from elsewhere. I believe locals thrive and have been thriving in their own way for generations. And I use that term thrive to mean finding a way to make it, not necessarily accumulate great wealth, although some have. And then there are the people who move here, who in nature might be classified as a foreign or alien species with different characteristics. Now, I'm not saying that people from the mainland or other parts of the world are different species, but they are somewhat different than locals. And Hawaii has been a very interesting setting for this clash of local culture with new outside influences. And it's not really a clash in the sense of two animals butting heads with each other, but more like a large rock that's just sitting there by the ocean. And over time, it gets smooth and worn out because the waves are consistently hitting it. So chapter 1, a little boring, but kind of fun to think about all the things that formed here in Hawaii. Chapter 2, From the Sunswept Lagoon. So this is the story of the first navigators from Bora Bora to Hawaii. And in Bora Bora, the people were being forced to worship a new god from Hawaii. Facing that tough choice, they decided to leave Bora Bora for a distant island. And they didn't really know exactly where they were going. They just used the stars. It was a terrible journey for them, but they eventually find a new place, which we now call Hawaii. What I like about this chapter, especially in contrast to the first chapter, is that there are great characters and dialogue. It is both gruesome and adventurous at the same time. And as I first started reading this chapter, I was wondering how this was relevant to Hawaii. I had to actually look up Bora Bora on the map, and when I saw how far it was and how easily they could have missed Hawaii, it's just amazing that they even found land. A couple of key passages that I want to point out. The first is, there was, however, one overriding characteristic that marked these defeated people as they swept into the storm. They did have courage. And that was when the people were first leaving Bora Bora to discover Hawaii. And again, I use that term discover very loosely. You gotta give them a lot of credit. It did take a lot of courage and bravery to take on such a voyage. I mean, I'll admit that I'm not really a boat kind of guy. I mean, I can't even remember the last time I was on a boat. It might have been whale watching when I was in school, but I can imagine how difficult it would be to travel on an ocean with the currents and the wind and the sun. And at night, you only have the stars to navigate with. Meanwhile, you're running out of supplies. And the second passage was, the course seemed so improbable, to head for a promised land by fleeing it, that the king cried, "Can we be sure that this is the way?" "No," the old man confessed, "we cannot be sure." "Then why?" "Because the only knowledge we have says that this is the way to do it." When I read this last line, I couldn't help but think about how we tend to do things in Hawaii, because that's the way we've always done it. And that's both good and bad. I'm sure it must drive people who aren't from here crazy. It's good that we do things like we've always done because it's tradition. For example, we play fireworks at New Year's, even though it's illegal, because it's tradition. And that's how it's always been. However, it's also a bad thing in the sense that sometimes, but not always, but sometimes, we aren't open to improvements or change. Either that, or it takes a significant amount of financial or social benefit to enact the change. And I think we see this in the adoption of solar panels in Hawaii, the primary benefit being financial savings, and the welcoming of certain outside businesses, such as Olive Garden, which at the time was such a big deal. Chapter 3, From the Farm of Bitterness. So this was a story of the missionaries arriving in Hawaii, and it centers around Abner Hale, a young missionary who travels with a group of missionaries and their families from the East Coast to Hawaii. And it documents their struggle to get to Hawaii and then the eventual acclimation of the missionaries to the locals in Lahaina, Maui. And at the end, some of the missionaries leave the ministry to start very lucrative businesses. But there's Abner, fully committed to the very end. Abner Hale is such a tragic character. There's this scene where Abner is walking around the village with Malama, who's the ali'i nui, and Abner is just pointing out all the things that are wrong with the village. You know, the broken fish pond, the tobacco, the whiskey, the relations with the sailors, slavery. I mean, it shows that he cares, yet he doesn't have compassion. And sadly, I can relate to him. There have been times in my life that I was so focused on the mission, on whatever it is that I was trying to do, that I completely missed emotionally the people that I was trying to help. And in the end, what often happens is that movement dies with you, which is tragic because there's all that time and energy and effort that is for nothing. So a couple of quotes that stood out to me in this chapter. On Hawaii's greatest need, teach the people to read. Absolutely yes. This is even applicable to today. I wish there was a way to get local kids interested in reading. I mean, I understand with social media and cell phones, it's extremely hard for kids to want to read since reading is, in comparison, boring. I just wish that kids understood why reading is so important and that it can be interesting and fun. Let me clarify. The act of reading itself isn't always fun, but the use of the imagination and critical thinking, as well as the analysis and discussion after the reading, are fun experiences. And this also applies to adults in Hawaii. I mean, be honest, when was the last time you read a book when you didn't have to? And the second quote, but do you know why I could not be humble? Why, Abner asked carefully. Because you were not humble. Your ways were always right, mine were always wrong. Your words were always white, mine were black. You tried to make me speak Hawaiian because you wanted to learn Hawaiian, and I would not beg you to join your church because you spoke of humility but knew it not. Today, Makua Hale, with the fort destroyed and your home knocked down by your own people, we're equals. And this was a conversation between Malama and Abner. This passage reminds me of the importance of humility. Today's society tends to be kind of polarizing at times, especially on social media and in the news. I mean, things are often written about in extremes when in real life it's a lot of gray area. And this exchange between Malama and Abner was significant because for the first time, Abner could not talk from a place of authority, where he's talking down as a missionary to a Hawaiian. But great chapter, great characters, and we really get a feel for what those first missionaries had to deal with. Chapter 4, From the Starving Village. So this chapter is a story of a Chinese family coming to Hawaii, and it centers around a Chinese woman named Nyuk Sin, who overcomes so much in her life to become the leader of a family hui. What's also nice about this chapter is there's some historical events, particularly about the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. When you read this chapter, you get a sense of the rough conditions coming here. I mean, we don't think about that because we travel through planes, but back then everything was by boat. They also talk about the struggles of leprosy in Hawaii, the dirtiness in Chinatown, and all of the fires, and of course the building of a family from nothing. And while I come from a Japanese family, I did have some Chinese friends growing up. And it always seemed like their story in Hawaii was somehow different than mine. The Chinese have a certain reputation in Hawaii, and I won't go too much into that, but it was nice to read a fictional account of the Chinese immigration to Hawaii because it was very different from that of the Japanese. And just a couple of quotes I wanted to highlight. The first is, "But the Chinese in these same empty hours were thinking, I'll bet a rich American like this one never knew such things before." And although Whipple and his Chinese friends could talk about many things, on this fundamental fact of emigration, they could never communicate. And this passage reminds me that people's stories are sometimes similar, even if we don't think they are. I mean, how the missionaries and the Chinese arrived to Hawaii were in very different circumstances and conditions, yet they both traveled a great distance, and the trip itself was tough for both groups. I mean, it's not like they traveled on the Star of Honolulu with a buffet and musical entertainment. Ocean journeys in those days were tough, with very limited space and horrid conditions, and I'm surprised more people didn't die on the trip to Hawaii. And the second passage, because a boy who could read would sooner or later come upon some book that would give him an idea, and a boy with an idea could accomplish almost anything. So the context of this quote was in the Chinese wanting to get educated in the local private schools. The Caucasian families were trying to keep them out of Iolani because they knew that once they were able to get an education, like a private school education, it would disrupt the status quo. And again, I return to the importance of reading. How do we get these local kids excited about reading? Chapter 5, From the Inland Sea. So this chapter centers around the Japanese coming to work the plantation. It centers around one man who starts a family and really struggles with the identity of himself as his sons become more Americanized. And I particularly enjoyed this chapter being Japanese American. I felt like I was reading about my own people. And in a way, maybe I was. So just a few passages from this chapter. In the traditional pattern of Hawaii, the intelligence and dedication of one man had transformed a potential good into a realized one. Now this was about Wild Whip bringing water from the windward side of Oahu to the west side for agriculture, because he noticed that the water fell on one side, but all the real big land that was available for ag was on the dry side. And if you're on Oahu, or if you're familiar with Hawaii, you know the west side of Oahu, central Oahu, it's pretty dry. But I love that one person can bring great change and impact to a place like Hawaii. And today we see the names of some of these people on buildings or highways or streets, but I don't believe that's over. I still think it's possible to make great changes still in Hawaii. Mr. Hale, do you know why Hawaii is so dreadfully dull? Why it's such a wasteland of the human intellect? Because nobody speculates about these islands. Nobody ever writes about them. Aren't you ever perplexed over the fact that Nebraskans write fine novels about Nebraska and people in Mississippi write wonderful things about Mississippi? Why doesn't anybody ever write about Hawaii? So this was a conversation between an English teacher talking to Mr. Hale about his son Bromley, who wrote a very ironic piece about the missionaries coming to Hawaii. And of course the dad was furious, but the teacher acknowledged the son's genius. Why don't people write about Hawaii? And when I think about that today, I would love to write about Hawaii. I would love to do that. And that's a lot of what this YouTube channel is about, talking about Hawaii and speculating and analyzing. Because for me, it's not enough to just live here and appreciate all that we do have. I want to dig a little bit deeper, and I want to find out why and how things came to be. And when I know, and when I have written what I know, then I'll control Honolulu in a manner you never dreamed of, because I'll control its imagination. Now this is Bromley talking to his father. He's gonna be a writer, and I like that he points out it's a different kind of control and aspiration to write about Hawaii. Now I'm very cautious to say that my ambitions for this YouTube channel are to somehow control Hawaii. I mean, I really am just here to help people and share more about this place that I call home. But social media does make it a little easier for a person like me to influence a lot more people than I would have been able to in the past. I mean, you have a camera and a microphone and you can reach thousands of people, even more people than traditional media. And with that comes influence and control. And that's something that I'm very much aware of and I take great caution with. It was in this way that Kamajiro Sakagawa opened his grocery store. And because he was a frugal man and worked incredibly hard, and because his wife had a knack of waiting on Japanese customers and his barber daughter a skill in keeping accounts, the store flourished. So I wanted to highlight this passage because it sounds a lot like my family's experience in Kaka'ako. My family a few generations ago, they had a grocery store in Kaka'ako, and if you go there today, you can actually see a picture of them in one of the alleys. And I'm proud of the fact that my family has roots in Kaka'ako because that's where I'm raising my family today. Chapter 6, The Golden Men. So this chapter closes the book and continues the story of the rise of the unions in Hawaii and the change of how labor is controlled. It proposes the question of what is the golden man? Like basically, what has the local become? And that's a really good question to ask. I've talked about what it means to be local before, and it's something that's really hard to pinpoint, and it's kind of a changing definition, but I still think that it's important to pursue that definition, to become aware of what we consider local. And it's not for exclusivity to leave people out, but really just to gain a better understanding of local culture. And just highlighting a couple of passages, the excitement of ideas, quests. I'm afraid Hawaii will never begin to understand true intellectual excitement, and I refuse to waste my life here. So in this scene, Goro's wife, Akemi, is about to leave Hawaii and return to Japan because she's pretty bored. And I do sometimes think that Hawaii may be intellectually boring, but then I think about the complexities of this culture and this place, like all of the ethnicities and the foods and the social constructs that we accept and navigate in Hawaii. And that's what I get excited about when I think about ideas for this YouTube channel. I mean, what has made Hawaii Hawaii, and what makes Hawaii Hawaii today? So to close, I wish I read this book when I was younger. It would have done me so much good to read things that are relatable to someone who grew up here, because it should be what I know best, Hawaii. I remember back in high school during my senior year, our teacher gave us the option of reading the standard English canon, consisting of classics to prepare us for the AP exam, or we could read some local literature. And at the time, seeing as how I didn't think I'd ever pass the AP test, I went for the local lit since I thought it would be easier. And in a lot of ways it was easier, but it exposed me to stories that were about where I was from. So although I didn't pass the AP test at the end of the year, I felt like I had a better understanding of local literature, something that I feel we don't really have a grasp on here in Hawaii. And so this book by Michener is intimidating for sure, but it's so great because it talks about Hawaii in ways that you just don't get by watching videos. And ironically, I had to travel all the way to Colorado, to the University of Northern Colorado, which the library is called Michener Library, to even be aware of this book. If you're looking for a great book to read, I highly recommend Hawaii. I mean, yeah, it's super long, but the stories are so rich and entertaining, and you get to use your imagination. And for someone from Hawaii, they're meaningful. So thanks for watching, and Aloha.
Hello.